Not that this should surprise anyone, but people can enjoy a multitude of styles of music out there. And when it comes to the relationship between rap and metal, I feel like to an extent it is quite difficult for metal fans to get into rap just because it's kind of viewed as these two styles of music are the polar opposites of each other. However, I have noticed that metal fans tend to find enjoyment with rap music when they tend to have a certain theme or a certain style that kind of in a way mirrors the aesthetic and attitude of metal with its characteristics. And I feel like when it comes to at least this video, which I'll be discussing all rap albums that would appeal to metal fans, it's mostly styles of music and rap that would be categorized as like industrial rap, experimental rap, and horrorcore. And while I'm aware that this conversation is nothing new, as I'm probably going to be echoing a lot of groups that people are familiar with that have been brought up in a conversation like this, regardless, I still feel like it needs to be mentioned, at least on my channel. So I'll be starting it off with like all of the acts that most of you guys probably already know, such as Death Grips with their album Bottomless Pit. These guys are basically like the most famous internet band going right now, and I know throughout the years they've been talked about highly throughout so many different people here on the internet, and I know this is kind of like such a bare, basic choice to recommend here, but it's kind of like ground zero for anyone who is a metal fan that wants to get into rap. This is like the album I feel like to get into. And while I'm aware that The Money Store will always be the fan favorite album in their discography, The Bottomless Pit just feels so much more aggressive and just more high energy, especially on the drumming aspect on this album, that I would almost call it personally, as ridiculous as this is, like Bastille hip hop, because Zach Hill's drumming, it's like, I know he's always had such a signature sound, but good God, it's like, this shit is just punishing, honestly, on the percussions. It's really impressive, and it just emulates just such a extreme metal vibe, even though they're not technically playing in the style. And obviously, Ride's vocals just going frantic and crazy and all over the place as he shouts out each verse. It's just like the be-all end-all for a starting point if you're trying to get into hip-hop as a metal fan. Danny Brown, Atrocity Exhibition is another obvious choice, and I've noticed throughout the years after its release back in, I believe, 2016, more and more people and more online websites would hype this album out that it would appeal to both the alternative scene and metal scene, and I don't really feel like that's far-fetched. Take into account all of the components that this album gives off, that it just radiates just such a dark and high energy sounding album, where Danny Brown's verses, he has like that high kind of like, people almost say like a chimpanzee type of like scream that he does, but it's like really upbeat and just always high energy. Even when he's going for like the slower parts on the album, it still just has such high energy value to it. Then the production value on this album, just overall vibe of it from beginning to end, is just so dark and morbid, how he talks about drug addiction and his own personal life. And the percussions on here during some of the songs, especially the track Ain't It Funny, it's just super overblown and super abrasive, that just matches up with Danny's high energy verses, that it's just such a dark and just really upbeat album that, yeah, again, this would definitely appeal to anyone who enjoys metal. Clipping, Visions of Bodies Being Burned, is a really biased take on my behalf because, I mean, even wearing a Clipping shirt in this video, but always been a fan of them, and I think what's always attracted me to their sound throughout their whole discography is they've always had such a fascination with just experimentation when it comes to their beats and rhythm sections and songs. Gravediggaz flow can be also very upbeat and aggressive at times, but also have like this kind of like slick gangsta feel to it, but they've always had just such an edgy nature to them, and I feel like it's just solely because of that it would attract metal fans to some degree. And with their latest album that they did back in 2020, this is easily their darkest album and also the album that's most horrorcore fueled that they've done. Jedi Mind Tricks, Visions of Gandhi. When looking up online conversations similar to this video, I've noticed that everyone always brings up Jedi Mind Tricks, which makes perfect sense, but it's always a different album that they bring up. I feel like it really has to do with anything that Vinnie Paz has been a part of would definitely appeal to metal fans, because I believe Vinnie Paz himself is a metal fan, and throughout everything he's done in his own personal discography of every little project that he's been a part of and Jedi Mind Tricks, he always has references to like pop culture in metal in some of his verses. However, the reason why I would recommend Visions of Gandhi out of everything in the Jedi Mind Tricks discography is I've always looked at it that metal's overall sound is always to give off like a larger than life aspect. And in this particular album, I feel like Jedi Mind Tricks with their percussions, beats, and rhythm sections matches that energy. Their DJ Stoop truly outdoes himself on this album. Songs on here like Blood In, Blood Out, A Storm of Swords, and Kubra Kai truly showcase just really captivating stuff instrumentally, that if they were to ever release an album that's just an instrumentally only version of this, I would buy it up in seconds because it is just so well written. And when you include Vinnie Paz's verses that are visceral and aggressive sounding, it's just a match made in heaven, I feel like. That if you want some absolutely killer hardcore hip hop, you gotta give this a listen. Speaking of Vinnie Paz, I would also recommend the collaboration effort he did with Ill Bill called Heavy Metal Kings, which is a pretty on-the-nose title as what it's trying to represent and convey with the style. And while it's nothing reinventing the wheel, as it's just really aggressive hardcore hip-hop to give off the vibe of metal music that both Ill Bill and Vinnie Paz showcase on here, it's still really entertaining stuff. As well, I would also recommend Ill Bill, as some of his earlier work is really dark and gritty and aggressive hardcore hip-hop, especially the album The Hour of Reprisal. Again, nothing reinventing the wheel, but in the same style, just a bit darker of just really aggressive hardcore hip-hop. Necro, the prefix of death, is another obvious choice, but if you don't know it, you need to know it. This is what is considered to be, at least by Necro, as death rap, as it really kind of blends both the worlds of death metal to an extent and rap music. But even when it's just solely on the rap side of things, it's very dark, morbid, and kind of has like a very violent nature to it. Just the straight up rap songs would appeal to metal fans. But then there's other songs on here that have death metal being played through. I believe John Tardy from Obituary is a special guest spot on this album, along with the drummer of Obituary too. So there's one part where it just is like straight up Obituary being played, and then you have Necro's verses come right through it. That really, again, I think perfectly blends these styles of music together. As well too, I believe it's the song on here, Push It to the Limit, that has the vocalist of Hatebreed doing the chorus for the hook on the song, which is really awesome. Along with other metal musicians, as I believe it was either the bassist or guitarist of Vector is featured on one of the songs, Sid Wilson from Slipknot is featured on this album, and if that doesn't prove enough that this album's trying to be as metal as possible for a rap album, just look at the album artwork, as it's done by Ed Repka, who was responsible for doing the album artwork for Death's Scream Bloody Gore and Megadeth's Rust in Peace. How I personally look at it, this is the ultimate album of blending both styles of death metal and hip-hop music together. And I would also recommend as well just really checking anything else that Necro did, as it blends the styles not necessarily of death metal, but that dark and just harsh and violent nature of rap music that kind of in a way shows interest with metal. But with this particular album, he makes it known that he wanted to blend influences of death metal with rap music, and it is just such a killer album from start to finish. Gravediggaz, 6 Feet Deep, is another obvious choice, as a lot of people point to them as the pioneers for the style of music known as horrorcore. Like most of the albums I've talked about thus far, it's dark and aggressive, but the themes of this album makes it feel as if it's some of the members from Wu-Tang Clan, but as if they were fascinated more with like horror movies, and they blended that kind of like aesthetic into their sound, and the end result is the first album by Gravediggaz. And it's just a really fun album that has themes similar to that of what you would find in metal music. And just that connection alone, I feel like, should appeal to metal fans. But because of its just dark and aggressive nature, it just makes it fun to listen to as well. And again, I know I'm just stating really obvious choices at the moment right now, but if you don't know Gravediggaz 6 Feet Deep, you definitely need to change that. Jizza, Liquid Swords, is something I wanted to include because with Gravediggaz, when I was getting into them, I had a friend who recommended me I check out this particular album. And not only because it has a member of Wu-Tang Clan, but while it doesn't have like the same dark, aggressive sound as Gravediggaz, what it does have a lot of is that kind of like cutthroat attitude, although it's used a bit more professionally, as Jizz is mostly known for using a lot of wordplay and metaphors when it comes to his lyrics. And again, while it's not as aggressive, I feel like the cutthroat attitude of like its vibe and verses might appeal to metal fans, but I know I'm kind of like digging a bit deep here with recommendations. But if you enjoy Gravediggaz, at least give this album a shot. Dälek Absence is an industrial hip-hop album that is ultra dark, super abrasive, and just devoid of any beauty, light, or optimism. That I feel like this is the album that would perfectly appeal to black metal fans, because it sounds like it's an album that was designed for an apocalypse. And I don't mean to overhype them, but really anything that Dälek did in the early 2000s from their early years is honestly way ahead of their time, that if they were to release their stuff today, I feel like they would be a lot more known, at least among, you know, just certain music fan bases, because I feel like in the early 2000s, like, experimental and industrial hip-hop was still something that was just ignored or was new or just didn't find its fan base. But I feel like now, as just more music scenes have popped up and it's kind of inviting more like niche little ideas, they definitely would have been bigger in today's standards. But regardless, if you just want really just a really abrasive and creative hip-hop album, I strongly recommend anything of the early years by Dälek. 3-6 Mafia, World Domination. Now, when it comes to Memphis hip-hop, 3-6 Mafia are kind of like one of the big titans of a name when it's brought up in that scene. And with their album World Domination, they got a bit nastier on this album as they started including elements of horrorcore. So things just got more aggressive, things got louder, things got harsher, I feel like. And when you take into account just all the verses and members almost having like chorus shouting and all their different verses where they just kind of like get really in your face with the aggression, I don't see as to why 3-6 Mafia couldn't appeal to any metal fan base. Techno Animal, Brotherhood of the Bomb is like the ultimate industrial hip hop album because everything about it just feels so monumental when you take into account just the lineup on it. For one, Techno Animal is the side project to that of Justin Broderick, who is mostly known for being in Godflesh. And during like the late 90s and early 2000s, I noticed when you take into account Justin Broderick's like a massive discography, he had a fascination more with hip-hop music. Especially with Godflesh's album Us and Them, there's a strong hip-hop element and vibe going on in that album. And when you take into account Brotherhood of the Bomb, which was released in 2001, and funny enough, it was released on September 11th of 2001, which is just very ironic when you look into the album title, you can see as to why Justin Broderick showed fascination with it. But not only is it just like these really big and overblown beats that are just full of density that I feel like people who enjoy Godflesh can appreciate, but it's just the lineup, as you have LP, who, you know, was going to be in Run the Jewels later on. You have Dälek in one of the songs, and I believe the group, it's either Rubber Room or Rubber Face, is a part of the opening track on here, which just, they kill it for the intro track on this album. I can never get sick of that song. But yeah, if you want, like, in my personal view, like the monumental industrial hip hop album, you need to know this and listen to this ASAP. Blackie, True Spirit and Not Giving a Fuck. Again, another hip hop artist that you could really listen to anything in their discography and you'll find some fascination with it. But I chose this album just solely because it has the song War Child, which is easily Blackie's most aggressive and overblown song that I just want to like bash my head into a brick wall over and over again because it is just so obnoxious, and that's what I love about it. And one thing I'll say about Blackie's work is that I think he's really underappreciated. And it's only brought up in conversation when people say, oh, Blackie, he just sounds like Death Grips. And you are really underselling him if that's all you can say, just solely because he has like very abrasive and noisy beats and his vocals kind of do sound like Ride to an extent. But the big difference between Blackie and Death Grips is, for one, Blackie's overall sound has way more of a punk vibe to it. And another difference that he has is he's just way more emotive sounding than anything Death Grips will ever put out. That, all I can say, don't ignore Blackie. If you just want very abrasive, emotive, hardcore hip hop, Blackie's always been someone I've always recommended to people when the discussion's brought up. Blackhandpath Egregore, which is actually playing in the background right now, is a recommendation that I'll admit is a stretch to include, just solely because out of everything I've talked about and will talk about in this video, this is easily the most overblown, which I know is a stretch, but I would almost consider this like brutal hip-hop music, because every little thing about this release is just through the roof sounding. That I feel like when he was mixing and mastering this album, he just went to every knob and just cranked it to 11. From the vocals, the instrumentation, and the beats, everything just feels like it's trying to reach for the sky with its sound. He's shouting and screaming out these verses. You have these beats that almost in an extent sound like a mixture of like power electronics and hardcore hip hop, like smashing into each other every second. But I feel like it's because of this wild and just obnoxious approach that he does that it will be like metal friendly to some extent, because let's be honest, a lot of metal fans like to have that edgy and over the top sound that's always trying to be like the next step of intensity. This matches that, but in the world of hip-hop. Speaking of brutal hip-hop music, the only thing that I've come across that at least rivals Blackhandpath, even though it's not as abrasive and noisy, but still in the vein of like brutal sounding, would be MC Bushpig with the album Wank of Death. Now this is considered to be gore rap, as think of the aesthetic of gore grind and brutal death metal that's now being presented to you, but in the style of horrorcore and hardcore hip hop. That it's niche to say the least, as I really haven't come across much else that is similar to this. And I'll give it to MC Bushpig for at least owning up to his own style and creating it and really making it his own thing. But for people who just like brutal music, not just in the sense of like brutal death metal and gore grind, if you just like gory, brutal music, I think this is like the only way that this could appeal to someone. And the final inclusion is going to be Captain Murphy with his soulful length album, Duality. Now this is the alias to that of Flying Lotus, all done by Steven Ellison. And unlike everything else I've talked about in this video thus far, where everything else is trying to be aggressive, dark, abrasive, and over the top, this is none of that. This is more in vein of like psychedelic. It's a bit slower and has elements of like, I don't know, acid jazz, psychedelic hip hop, and you know, styles of music similar to that I feel like for people who enjoy, you know, psychedelic rock, stoner doom metal, can find some fascination with this album. And while I know there are tons of artists out there that do psychedelic and trippy hip-hop music, maybe it's just my bias coming through here that I've always been just such a fan of Steven Ellison's work, that it's always appealed to me more, and I just wanted to include just solely because I've always enjoyed this particular album, and it's a bummer that this is the only thing he's ever done with Captain Murphy. But again, if you're a fan of any kind of like trippy psychedelic metal, this kind of radiates that vibe to a certain extent. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, links provided to everything I talked about will be in the description below. Really curious to know what are albums that you think in hip-hop would appeal to metal fans. Very curious on this. And other than that, like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.